Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA, the R show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome to this episode. The purpose of this entire show is for technical operators, whether you're a database administrator, systems engineer, or a systems analyst who happens to know a thing or two about databases, and you need to work with SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery solutions. This is for you. Although I focus so much on always on availability groups in majority of these episodes, mainly because Microsoft has been pushing always on availability groups as kind of like the go-to high availability solution for your SQL Server databases, whether or not it's the right solution for you. So sometimes customers end up having always on availability groups, even though they don't really need always on availability groups. And it is a little bit of a challenge, especially if you don't have any other choice but to work on those infrastructures and deployments, and you're struggling, you're not quite sure what to do, and it's causing issues, and ChatGPT and AI and Google is no longer giving you the right information because it's all over the place. And sometimes AI is hallucinating, right? The topic of today's conversation, or today's episode, it's kind of like a continuation of something that I did a couple of weeks ago. So several weeks ago, I talked about the science and the art of troubleshooting issues when it comes to SQL Server always on availability groups. And I highly recommend that you go back to that video, because I kind of categorized issues into two, okay? Either it's an emergency situation or a 911 situation where databases are offline, all hands on deck, everybody's going to be working on bringing databases back online because your mission critical applications depend on it. Or on the flip side, the second category is more like an ordinary end user or a support request. Maybe an issue that has something to do with end users working, but not necessarily an emergency situation, but could potentially lead to an outage situation, okay? This is kind of like, because that was kind of like a high-level overview, but I wanted to focus more at this time on how I troubleshoot and resolve outages. Okay, and when I mean outages, I mean databases are offline, nobody can access the databases, maybe SQL Server's offline, or maybe the failover cluster is offline. Anything that translates to service interruption. Okay, and I wanted to cover this because in an emergency situation, you have two different kinds of responses. Okay. If hopefully you have a proper monitoring tool in place, your monitoring tool will pick up on it, and then you'll know, as somebody who's managing an infrastructure, mission critical infrastructure, you get to see exactly what the issue is, and you know how to deal with it. Okay. In cases where an end user reports that the database isn't accessible, then you kind of have to wonder, is it really an outage situation, or is it just a perception of an outage? Because again, from the point of view of the end user, it is an outage, but maybe there's something going on their side, but not necessarily happening on the database infrastructure side. And I want to focus on outages here because this determines how you should respond. Okay, because again, in an outage situation, there's service interruption. I find it interesting when people would say, or customers would say, we need zero downtime and zero data loss, yet when outage situations happen, they take their time trying to resolve an issue, which again is completely inconsistent with how they would want their databases to be highly available. So really focusing on dealing with and handling outage situations. Now, again, highly recommend that you go back to the episode that I did on the science and the art of troubleshooting issues, because again, even before you resolve an issue, you have to know how to distinguish between an outage situation or an end user request or a support request that may not necessarily be causing service interruption. Okay, let's dive into this, because this excuse me, is the approach that I use whenever I get brought in, and again, outage situation, they bring me in, I analyze the situation, and this methodology in this process, it what spells the difference between taking 4 hours to resolve an outage situation versus 5 minutes. Okay, 4 hours versus 5 minutes. And I have taken this from the training class that I do for my customers in the online course, the SQL Server Always On Available Groups, the Senior DBA's Ultimate Field Guide. I've taken this as a portion of that training, and I want to share it with you because, again, this methodology is something that I've used every time an outage situation happens and we need to bring the databases online fast. The key idea there is bringing the databases online fast. Okay, and I've learned all of these. I've learned this methodology from when I was still working as a data center engineer, mostly with failover clustered instances, because you know it was way back when SQL Server 2000, 2005, 2008, when failover clustered instances were the only high available, well, you can call database mirroring a high availability solution, but of course you have to worry about client connectivity, redirection to the new, what do they call it back then, principal database. So I've learned this working with failover clustered instances, and I've taken it into the world of always on availability groups, because SQL Server still relies on the Windows Server failover clustering for high availability. So I want us to take into account this one idea. If you are working in on an emergency situation or an outage situation, okay, this is the one thing that you have to, left, right, this is the one thing that you have to really keep in mind. Okay, in an outage situation, of course, again, keeping in mind that when you get either an alert from your monitoring tool or a ticket or a phone call, you have to assess the situation. Is it an emergency situation where there is service interruption, or it's just an end user request or a support issue that we need to resolve? Because those are two different things that you have to deal with, and you respond differently. But in an outage, if let's say you are 100% sure that it is an outage situation, you can't access the databases, there's something wrong with the infrastructure, and you know for a fact, and hopefully it does not take you more than 5 minutes to determine whether or not it really is indeed an outage situation with the proper telemetry and a monitoring tool configured throughout. And I'm not just talking about your databases. You have to monitor every piece of the entire infrastructure, from databases to SQL Server to the operating system to the failover cluster to the hardware like the storage subsystem. If you're using a storage area network, your networking, your Active Directory, DNS, anything that that makes up your entire always-on availability group infrastructure, you gotta monitor that. So again, not just database, because I've had customers in the past where they were monitoring the databases, or specifically they were monitoring SQL Server, the service, and they were able to connect to the SQL Server instance, but it's just one piece of the entire availability group infrastructure. They can connect to it, they can query the system metadata, because your system databases and SQL Server, the service in and of itself, is not controlled by the Windows Server failover cluster. And so they were monitoring that, not realizing that the databases are offline. And they said, well, we can connect to the SQL Server instance. We can run select at version, and we're getting something. How come you're telling me the databases are offline? So again, you have to monitor the entire infrastructure to really get a sense of whether or not you have an outage situation. So getting back into this, in an outage situation, there's only one goal. Excuse me. The goal is to bring the AG online and the databases inside the AG as quickly as you possibly can. That is the only goal. Okay? The goal is not to prove that you're right or the sysadmins were wrong or it's the vendor's fault. That's not the fault. Rather, the goal. The goal is to bring the AG online, the databases, as quickly as you possibly can. It's tempting to do an RCA. Okay? It is very tempting to do an RCA, meaning a root cause analysis. So while you're doing your troubleshooting, while you're trying to bring the availability group online as quickly as you possibly can, you can get sidetracked, and I still fall into this. You can get sidetracked. Oh, I see this error message. This could be the problem. Let me dig deeper. No, this is not the time for you to do an RCA. Okay? You do a root cause analysis after things are back to normal. Okay? And might as well highlight that there. You do an RCA, or root cause analysis, after everything is back to normal. Business as usual. I have to emphasize this because, again, in an emergency situation where people are behind you, overlooking your shoulder as you're working on something, or you have teammates on Slack or on Teams or a customer on the phone screaming at you, they would want updates, and it's fine to provide updates if it only takes you like 2 seconds, or maybe copy and paste a response. The typical canned response that I would normally tell people asking for an update: I'm doing the best that I can to bring the databases online as quickly as I possibly can. You can steal that response. Again, just setting the expectation, because if, again, in an outage situation, it's an emergency situation, and everybody wants to get involved. Everybody wants to do what they needed to do, and especially, ironically, in an emergency situation, all eyes are on you. So you will get the attention of the top dog, the CEO, the CIO, the CTO, everybody will be asking for an update. Okay? Resist the temptation to provide detailed analysis, and resist the temptation to provide complete explanation of what you're doing. Okay? Because this is the most important thing that you need to do when an outage situation happens. I had to overemphasize this, because I've been in so many outage situations where we have a war room set up and everybody's doing their thing because they think that's the way to bring the databases online, and then there would be decision makers pestering people, hey, give me an update. And more often than not, I have to bring everybody on the same page. Can we stop what we're doing right now and focus on the goal, which is this? Anything that has nothing to do with achieving the goal of bringing the databases and the availability group online as quickly as we possibly can, we have to get rid of it, or we have to ignore it for now. Again, do not be tempted to find a root cause, and do not be tempted to provide a detailed explanation of what's going on, because every second counts. And if you have a very tight SLA and you have very tight recovery time objective, every second that you spend not doing this is time that you're taking away from your recovery time objective and your service level agreement. Again, overemphasizing this because very, very, very important. Now, let me share with you what I call my workflow process whenever I get brought in, or whenever I have to deal with an outage situation. Okay, I follow a workflow process, and this determines the actions that I will have to take. First, there's an outage. Okay, we have identified it is an outage. It's an emergency situation. There's service disruption. Here is the first thing that I will check. Is the failover cluster online? Okay, is the failover cluster online? Why is that? Because high availability in SQL Server is dictated by the Windows Server failover cluster. SQL Server relies on the Windows Server failover cluster for high availability. So if the failover cluster is online or not, that determines kind of like the branch and the action that I will have to take. So if the failover cluster is online, then I will follow what I call my 5-step process. I'm going to share that with you within the next couple of slides. I will follow my 5-step process. Okay, pretty simple, right? If the failover cluster is not online, I have no other choice but to force start the cluster without quorum. Because there's nothing that I can do on the SQL Server side, on the database side, if my failover cluster is not online. Okay, the goal, and I try to simplify it as much as I can, because typically when you get an error, you get notification that there is an outage, you'll grab the error message from your alert, your email alerts, post that error message or error number on to either Google or ChatGPT or Perplexity, and you start going through resources and information about that specific error. But that is already cutting short and taking time away from your recovery time objective. That's why I want to simplify it as much as I possibly can. Okay, so there's an outage. Is the failover cluster online? That's the first question that I ask. If it is online, meaning I have proven that it is online, then I will go through the 5-step process. So what's the 5-step process? So when you encounter a problem or an issue, ask the question, is the failover cluster accessible? That's a very simple test. A simple ping test to the virtual network name. Now keep in mind that your failover cluster has its own virtual network name, or from the point of view of Active Directory, its own cluster name object. Do a ping test. That would take you less than a minute. Or in organizations where ICMP responses are disabled, meaning doesn't matter whether you do a ping test or whether it's up and running, you're not going to get any responses. You can log into the failover cluster either through remote desktop and then use the cluster name object to log into the server. Okay. In my case, I'm too lazy to even use remote desktop. I'll use test-net connection, the PowerShell commandlet, where you're providing the virtual network name for the failover cluster, and then log in. I will do either a PowerShell remoting session where I will log into it, and if I can, I know for a fact that the failover cluster is online. That's why I said the decision tree is as simple as, is the cluster online? If yes, follow my 5-step process. So the first thing in my 5-step process, the first item, is reviewing the dependency report. And this is interesting because it's tempting to jump into the most complicated step. Okay, if you have a 5-step process, the 5th is almost always the most complicated step. There's a reason why I wanted you to check if the failover cluster is up and running first, because it simplifies the way you troubleshoot an outage, and it also starts with the simplest one. In fact, when I was teaching this class a couple of years, about 7 years ago, one of the attendees asked, so why are you starting with this? I'm a SQL Server database administrator. Should I not be looking at SQL Server? And the answer is, sure, you can, but that's not where I would start. Remember the goal? The goal is to bring the availability group online as quickly as you possibly can. So even if you're a SQL Server database administrator and you can work on it from the SQL Server side of things, what if the issue is not SQL Server? So there's really nothing you can do from the SQL Server side to fix the problem. That's why I start with the simplest, and the easiest one. Review the cluster dependency report. And the cluster dependency report is kind of like a hierarchy of dependencies where your availability group, or let's start with the databases. Your databases sit inside SQL Server, and your databases are inside the availability group. Your availability group sits on top of the failover cluster. Your availability group also depends on the listener name, and your listener name depends on the virtual IP address. If your listener name is not even accessible, then there's nothing, and that's completely outside of SQL Server, by the way. If your listener name is inaccessible, there's nothing you can do inside SQL Server to bring that online. Okay, that's why I would always start with the dependency report. I will look at which resource is offline and check if there are dependencies. I just outlined the dependency hierarchy where your databases are sitting inside an availability group, and your availability group depends on your listener name, and your listener name depends on a virtual IP address. If any of those dependencies are not online, try starting the dependencies online first and see if that fixes it. Okay. And again, the reason I start off with this is if I look at the dependency report and found out that it's the virtual IP address that is offline, that's why my databases are offline, I would first start the virtual IP address, and then from there on, check if I can bring the listener name as a side effect of that. Now, if I cannot start the virtual IP address, then I will not even try. Because for one, it's outside of SQL Server. So what I'll do is I'll pick up the phone and call the person responsible for the virtual IP address, which normally it's network administrators or the systems administrators. So the first thing that I would do is I will look at the dependency report. And I've included failover clustered instance in here because again, these strategies I've learned from when I was still working with just failover clustered instances, and I've simply translated them over to always-on availability groups. So SQL Server cluster resource will not come online if the disks and network name are offline. For availability groups, the availability group will not come online if the network name is offline. And network name here, of course, refers to the listener name. Okay, from the point of view of SQL Server, it's the listener name. From the point of view of the failover cluster, it's a network name. And of course, the network name will not come online if your virtual IP address is offline. Okay, I worked on one case a couple of years back where the customer was doing regular maintenance, installed patches, rebooted the secondary, and then they're ready to failover. Okay, install the patches on the primary, forced the failover, but the failover is not happening. They could not bring the databases online. They could not bring the availability group online. And upon investigation, it took them like 4 or 5 hours troubleshooting. They could not bring the availability group online. They found out that their Active Directory administrator accidentally, and I say accidentally because nobody intentionally does this, accidentally deleted the corresponding virtual computer object in Active Directory. Now, here's the thing. Your listener name is a computer object. So how will it authenticate in Active Directory if you deleted the account that it needs to use to authenticate it? So that's why when they're trying to fail over to the secondary, it would not come online. The virtual IP address would come online, but then the virtual network name will not, unfortunately. Okay. Now, of course, recreating the virtual computer object in Active Directory will take longer than necessary because it will require what is normally referred to as a tombstone reanimation, which from the name itself, it's tombstone. You're trying to raise the dead. Okay. What I did in this case was, again, understanding that there is a dependency between availability group and the listener name. What I did was to delete the listener name and just created a DNS alias that points to the primary replica. Okay. Because I decoupled the dependency of the availability group from the listener name. Like I just deleted the listener name from inside the availability group. we were able to bring the databases back online and the availability group because there's no more dependency. Okay, again, that's why I start with this. Because if I can solve the problem with step number 1, why would I go to step number 2 and step number 3 and step number 4? Okay, start with the dependency report. Okay, so the second one, so I did say 5-step process. Step number 1 is I will look at the dependency report, see if there are resources in the cluster that depends on something that is not online. I will try to bring those online, and if I cannot, I will stop, pick up the phone, and call the person responsible for it, while also trying to figure out if I can decouple those dependencies. Okay, because you can decouple those dependencies. So that's the first one. The second one is reviewing the Windows event log. Okay. Notice that I did not say SQL Server error log. Because if the issue is outside of SQL Server, there is nothing you can do as a database administrator that would help. So focus on that first. I would look for event logs, and I'm specifically looking for failover clustering and level equal to error. Okay, stuff like if there is an error that would point me to an issue with networking or storage, okay, that caused the outage or caused the service interruption. So that's the second one. And notice how I would only move to step number 2 if I could not resolve the issue in step number 1. Okay, so if in step number 1 I found out that, hey, my listener name is not coming online, I will look at the Windows event log, and I would, if I'm a database administrator and I do not have permissions on the failover cluster, I will pick up the phone and call the person responsible for it. Sysadmin, server admin, they will have the permissions to decouple that, because you cannot do it from inside the availability group. It's offline, right? So they have to decouple the dependency, do that from inside the failover cluster, delete it, and then bring it online. As you're doing that, so let's say you're still in an outage situation, they still can't do it. Start looking at errors inside the Windows event log. Okay, and as you are going through, as you're going through the Windows event log, you as the database administrator can now start to look at the SQL Server error log. And notice that this is the only time I would look at the SQL Server error log, because maybe I have already started the listener name, I've already started the virtual IP address, but the available group is still not starting. Okay, the assumption here, of course, is that your SQL Server service is still up and running. Okay, because there's no way that you can bring your databases online if the SQL Server service is not running. So I will start looking at, again, only in step 3, even if I am a database administrator, only in step 3 will I review the SQL Server error log. I will look at, for instance, if I have a failover clustered instance as a replica in my AG, I will look at it like, treat it like a standalone instance. I will look at system database availability. I will look at file path, sometimes permissions on and ACLs on the folders where your databases are stored. I remember a case that I worked on, this was more than 20 plus years ago, where we were trying to recover a failover clustered instance where it was supposed to be a simple hardware refresh, meaning the vendor would replace the storage area network, but they rolled it back because it was taking longer, but then they couldn't start the SQL Server service. Okay. With a failover clustered instance, your SQL Server service runs on top of the failover cluster. Turns out that the registry entry for the fully qualified path for the SQL Server service, like a SQL Server service.exe, SQL Server.exe, followed the 8.3 file naming convention. And because of that, the registry could not find the executable file for running the SQL Server service. All we had to do was rename the entire path inside the registry. Now, it's not recommended to start messing around with the registry unless, of course, you know exactly what you're doing. But if you know for a fact that your SQL Server instance is not starting, look at the common reasons why. Maybe your TempDB is not getting recreated. Maybe your SQL Server service does not have permissions to recreate TempDB on a specific folder. Maybe SQL Server could not find the system databases. Maybe you have incorrect file paths to the executable, like what we had there. For availability groups, normally, and again, assuming that your SQL Server service is up and running, meaning you had started the SQL Server service because it's not dependent on the failover cluster, I would look for these keywords, resolving and failover. I have error 983 in here, which is an example where it tells me unable to access the database because its replica rule is resolving. If the database is in a resolving state, I will not be able to use the database because it's resolving, it's inaccessible. It has to complete crash recovery to bring it online in order for you to access the database. Okay. Another error, error 19406. The state of the local availability replica in availability group has changed from before state to after state. Okay, the replica state changed because of either a startup, a failover, a communication issue, or a cluster error. Descriptive, but this is kind of like the starting point of how I would look at the issue inside SQL Server. Okay. Now keep in mind, I will only do step 3 if I've done step 1 and I've done step 2, and now I have information that I can use in addition to step number 3 to figure out why the databases are inaccessible. And like I said, if I can solve the problem, if I can bring the databases online as quickly as I possibly can in step number 1, I will not even do this because the databases are back online. It's business as usual. Everybody's happy. That's the time that I would start doing a root cause analysis. I didn't have to do step number 3. Okay, I would only do this after again everything's back to normal. I did say 5-step process, right? Step number 4 is reviewing the cluster error logs. Now, I wanted to emphasize this because anecdotal evidence, maybe from survey from people who have been working with SQL Server, working with always-on availability groups, anything running on anything running on a failover cluster, the first thing that they would look at is the cluster error log. In fact, when I do this for my customers, doing the training for my customers, even survey, I did this for group buy conference back in 2018. Did a survey. What's the first thing you look at when you have an outage with your always-on availability groups? This was the first thing that they would look at, the cluster error log. And I can't blame them, because if you look at some of the Microsoft documentation, in presentations, YouTube videos, tutorials from Microsoft engineers, they would always point out to look at the cluster error log. Okay? I emphasize this because this should be your last option, not first. In fact, the only time that I would look at the cluster error log in an outage situation is when you know it's bad. It's really bad that I have to look at the cluster error log. Because for one, this is more of an RCA tool, a root cause analysis tool, rather than an issue resolution tool. That's why I start with step number 1, looking at the cluster dependency report. If the cluster dependency report tells me that I can simply bring the availability group online by bringing in the listener online, bringing it online, bringing the virtual IP address online, because the AG depends on those, then I don't have to look at the cluster error log. Okay, I will look at this again after everything is back to normal. It's business as usual, and I'm only doing an RCA, not bringing databases online. Okay, that's why I emphasize that this should be your last option, not the first. Like I said, I tell my customers, if you see me looking at the cluster error log, it's that bad. That bad. Okay, look for errors and before and after events that led to it, because that would give you some ideas on what was causing the problem. In fact, this is how we found out that the availability group that would not come online as a side effect of the virtual computer object associated with the listener name got deleted in Active Directory. But again, I did not look at the cluster error log while we were troubleshooting the issue. I looked at it after. Okay, I was able to bring the availability group online, deleted the listener name from inside of failover cluster just to break the dependency, brought the AG online, created a DNS alias that points to the primary replica, and after everything was back online, that was the only time that I started looking at this. That's how we found out that the virtual computer object got deleted. Should be your last option, not the first. Now, let's go back to that workflow process that I mentioned. There's an outage. The decision tree goes, if the failover cluster is online, follow my 5-step process. If the failover cluster is not online, then you don't have any other choice but to force the cluster to start without quorum. That's the only thing. Okay? Stop looking at the network, stop looking at the hardware, stop looking at anything else. If the cluster is offline, you have to bring the cluster online. Okay? If the cluster is inaccessible, so that decision tree right there, let me go back there. Decision tree right there. There's an outage. Is the failover cluster online? Yes, follow my 5-step process. No. If it is not accessible, meaning you did a simple ping test, no good. You did a you tried to log into the server using either a remote desktop or PowerShell, still no good. Worse if you have a hardware failure and the entire failover cluster is offline. Then, of course, before you even do this, bring the servers online first. Meaning, reboot the machine, bring the operating system back online. But if the servers are online, I mean the servers that form the failover cluster, and the failover cluster is offline, then you don't have any other choice but to force start a cluster without quorum. Okay? This is something that you can do in less than 5 minutes. However, because this is not something that you will be doing on a regular basis, you have to practice. Practice causing the cluster to lose quorum, and practice forcing start a failover cluster without quorum. Back in the Windows Server 2012 R2 days, it was a little bit challenging because you can only do this from within PowerShell. With Windows Server 2016 and higher, up to Windows Server 2025, you can use the console for this. You can log into the server that you want to host the cluster core resources, force start the cluster using the graphical user interface, and you can do that. Back then, PowerShell is the only way to go, or cluster.exe, but that's deprecated. After you force start the cluster without quorum, then you go back to the 5-step process. Okay? You go back to the 5-step process. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, he said 5-step process. I only saw 4. What's the 5th one? The 5th one is called Microsoft CSS. If at any point during the troubleshooting process you looked at the dependency report, tried bringing things online, and you still can't, decoupled the listener name, still can't bring the availability group online, looked at the Windows event log, looked at the SQL Server error log, nothing in there, you're trying to bring the databases online, you looked at the cluster error log, and you still can't figure things out, this is the time you call CSS. People laughed at me when I said this first time. I told them, look, I know it's because of the fact that it's ego. Like, my job is to bring this thing online, but I can't bring it online. So now you're trying to do everything and as best as you can to bring the databases online, but you can't. So what's stopping you from calling Microsoft is most of the time ego. Like, I need to prove myself. Nope, this is not the time to prove yourself. This is the time to bring the databases online as quickly as you possibly can, and if necessary, call Microsoft. In fact, this is I tell my customers all the time, when you're cutting close to your recovery time objective, meaning the amount of time, allowable downtime, when you're cutting close to that, it's no longer a technical conversation. And that's why you really have to keep watch on your recovery time objective as you're going through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. Because by then, it no longer is a technical conversation. It becomes a legal conversation, and I'm so not going to want to get involved in anything that involves lawyers. And this is where you have to call for support. I've declined several requests from customers where they were in an outage situation. They've been working on the issue for a couple of hours. They call me and they would want me to fix the issue. And I would ask them, so what's your recovery time objective? They've gone past the recovery time objective. In fact, that's the reason why they're calling me. And I know what the problem is based on their description, and I know I can bring the database online fast. But I still don't want to do it. Not because I cannot, but because it's no longer a technical conversation at that point. It becomes a legal conversation. And me getting involved means me being part of who's responsible for it. So when the legal matters start coming in, I certainly don't want to get involved with that. And that's why, again, you have to keep watch of the clock that's ticking. The minute that you have an outage, the minute that you get that alert, although in some cases, because of the frequency of the alerts, you might not get it immediately. But the moment that the databases come offline is the moment that the clock started ticking and the timeline or the countdown started towards your recovery time objective. Keep watch of that. I remember when I was working for a managed services provider, my manager would always say, don't be a hero. And what he meant by that was, we kept a very strict SLA. If you've gone beyond like 10, 15 minutes and you cannot solve the problem, escalate. Escalate. Raise the ticket or the issue to somebody who can fix the problem much better than you. Okay? We had to follow a tight SLA. And when we get the alert, every minute counts. If nobody's picking up on the alert, the next higher up in the hierarchy. So if a DBA missed the alert, the team lead will get the alert the next time. If the team lead missed it, the manager will get the alert the next time. If the manager missed it, the CTO will get the alert the next time. And so there's this escalation process baked into the monitoring and alerting to make sure that we're not missing our recovery time objective. Okay? Make sure that we're not missing our recovery time objective. And again, it is tempting to spend as much time, as much effort as you possibly can trying to resolve the issue. But please, if you're cutting close to your recovery time objective, call Microsoft, do yourself a favor, and call Microsoft. And that's also one of the reasons I simplify the process of troubleshooting. That's why I created this 5-step workflow process for troubleshooting outages. Because again, the goal, I'll go back to the very first slide. The goal is to bring the availability group online and the databases online as quickly as I possibly can so as to minimize downtime. Anything else is secondary. Even root cause analysis is secondary. I will only do that after I brought the databases online, because you have to meet your recovery time objective in your service level agreement. And that's why, if you noticed, a lot of the topics that I cover in this show, I always go back to the important topics like recovery point objective, recovery time objectives, and service level agreement. You have to get back into that, because that's why we're building a high availability solution. You want to meet that goal. That's why you're troubleshooting issues, because you want to meet that goal. Okay. There you go, my 5-step process for troubleshooting an availability group outage. Like I said, this is a part of the training that I usually do for my customers. Again, they would bring me in, resolve an outage, and then I would explain what I did using the 5-step workflow process, so that they can do the same thing if another outage happens, or maybe a different environment experiences an outage, and they can do it themselves. Okay, that is about it. And I would love I would love to show how to do that in real time, meaning real live action where there's an outage and I will have to resolve it, and I'll follow the 5-step process, maybe in a future episode. Okay, that is about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show, and I highly, highly recommend, when the recording is available, watch it again. Take notes, create your own process based on a 5-step workflow process for troubleshooting issues. Okay, because you know your environment better than I do. Okay, this just simplifies the way I would troubleshoot outages to make sure that they get resolved as quickly as I possibly can. Okay. Tune in again for the next episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. And if you have any questions, or if you need help, okay, if you need help, maybe you're having issues with your always on availability groups, you don't have the skills to manage a complex architecture, reach out, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's get on a call to discuss two things. One, what is the real challenge? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? And we are going to be clear on what the issues are, what the challenges are, and then the second part of that is coming up with a strategy to make sure that you address those issues and problems. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. This would point you to my calendar page where you can choose a time that works for you. Okay. And if I can help, I will do the best that I can. If not, I will steer you in the direction that will help serve you best. In fact, I remember a customer, they ended up becoming a customer a couple of years ago, where they wanted to deploy always on available groups on Linux. This was SQL Server 2017 timeframe. And I told them, if you do not have anybody on your team who knows Linux SpaceMaker, do not. Because you are going to cause more issues if you do not know how to bring an available group online. Just like how I went through the workflow process. With Linux, it's different. It's totally different approach with Linux, because that does not run on a Windows Server failover cluster. I told them, don't do it. Doesn't make sense, because it will jeopardize their high availability requirements. Anyway. Looking forward to having conversations with you. Use that link on the screen and schedule a strategy session. And again, that's about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show.